Today on the London Air, I'm chatting to a lady that I've been meaning to get on the show for a long, long time. I think it must be at least 8 or 9 years since I first met Breda Corish. And I think it was at an event. Do you know what? It could have been one of the St. Patrick's Day events originally at the embassy. Um, Breda has been involved with Irish in Britain. You were a trustee, Breda, with Irish in Britain for a number of years.
I was indeed.
I don't know how else I got to know you. I think that must have been it.
I think so. Well, first of all, Nessie, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here chatting to you today. As you'll gather, and your listeners will gather, it's all a bit of a passion project for me. What we're going to talk about. But yeah, I was also thinking when we first met, and I think you're absolutely right. I think it almost certainly was at one of the community receptions. At the Irish Embassy, which actually probably predated my becoming a trustee for Irish in Britain. And how I ended up at the embassy for the first time ever, I have to say, even though I'd been living in London for 30 years at that stage, was it was in late 2016, early 2017, I got involved with the London Irish abortion rights campaign, which was set up campaigning from over here for repealing the Eighth Amendment. That was kind of what pulled me, if you like, back into the Irish community over here, which I hadn't actually been involved with at all, literally for decades. And yeah, we had, I remember in that campaign group, yes, like many groups, we'd asked for a meeting with the ambassador, and we had that. And then we got to start going to some of the various receptions at the embassy. And I think that is where we met. And then it was through this extraordinary immersion at that time, through all the campaigning and so on, in the the amazing London Irish world, which I really had no great sense of before that. It was through that then that I made contact as well with Irish in Britain as a national charity, London Irish Abortion Rights Campaign. We had also become a member of Irish in Britain. And I suppose ultimately it was, the whole experience was an incredible eye opener. I was so impressed by the incredible, I suppose, breadth and depth of the things that people were doing over here and how much support people were providing for the many different facets of the Irish community over here, different generations, different causes. Yeah, it was an amazing wake up call for me personally, and that kind of has also brought me to where I am today.
I think when you move over here, well, for me anyway, like I stopped listening to Irish radio, for example, because you can't. Oh, it's like, oh, I should be going to that gig, or I should be doing this, or I should be doing whatever. And it's like, it's hard to live in two places at once.
Hmm.
Kind of have to decide where you're actually living
Oh,
and get
absolutely.
your life gone on in that way. So if you're living in London, yeah, it's easy to pop home, it's only an hour away or whatever, but you still have to have your kind of the daily boring stuff goes on here in London. It doesn't go on in Ireland, it doesn't go on in Dublin, it doesn't go on in Cork, wherever you're from. I think there comes a time when you realize that there has to be that separation, and it can be, it, it can, you can fall out, I suppose, of the little circle of Irish in London, but there's a huge Irish community here that people don't realize. But
Mhm.
once you get into it, it's really easy then to get to know a whole lot of people.
Yeah, and now it's interesting as you were kind of describing that piece about, do you live your lives in two places and when do you make that choice? Now, interestingly for me, I mean, I left Ireland and I very actively chose to leave Ireland within a few days of graduating from UCD in 1987. And to be honest, I could not get out of the country fast enough. Many of us will know Ireland in the 1980s. I mean, it had many great things. I loved my time at UCD. I had spent a summer as a student working as a chambermaid in London, 85. I did my J1 summer in Boston. But then I knew as soon as I graduated, it wasn't just the economic situation in Ireland. I found things very stifling over there. And the short visit I'd had to London in 85, I just loved the city. So in fact, when I came over, it was absolutely, I was throwing myself into London life. And I can even remember saying, I was very fortunate. I came over with two friends from university and we were flat hunting, as you do, very randomly. We live anywhere in zone two. We ended up in zone three. But I do remember saying to my friends, so long as we're central, I don't care where we live. But I said explicitly, I will not live in Kilburn or Cricklewood because my impression at the time was that the Irish community in London was, the product of that extraordinary waves of migration in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so on. And my impression, I had a very strong impression that the community over here was, if you like, clinging on to a version of Ireland which I was actively rejecting and leaving. So randomly end up living in Crouch End. Never heard of that place before. And then in another, I suppose, unexpectedly had my perhaps connection with Irish music. I've been into music at home. I thought I was pretty well informed, occasionally read the enemy. Um, but I met my English boyfriend, who is my husband almost 40 years later still. Um, and he was a huge, huge music fan. And it was actually through him that I started going to see bands like That Petrol Emotion and Micro Disney and A House and Stump and just that incredible, incredible time of kind of, alternative indie post-punk music in the late 80s and into the 90s.
Now that I think of it, the Irish and Britain exhibition that was touring around last year, you had a stump ticket in there, I think.
I did. I did. Yeah, there was lots of tickets for Micro Disney, lots for the Petrols, only ones for the Pogues for me. And I think I actually only saw Stump, uh, amazing band. I would assume many of your listeners will know that amazing band from Cork. Yeah, it was some extraordinary kind of multi-band gig at the what was the Town and Country Club in Kentish Town. And yeah, to my dying day, I'll be very happy that I got to see Mick Lynch performing on stage because that was just mind-blowing.
So all these experiences then led to 2020.
Yeah.
Now, 2020 was life transformation or transforming for many, many people for different reasons. Yes, we had lockdowns. Lots of people reevaluated where they were going and what they wanted to do within life. Is that what happened to you in 2020?
Oh, it did. And as I would say, life-changing with on steroids, if you like, because I had actually found out just before Christmas 2019, the day before the general election, in fact, there was a big reorganization at the corporation I worked for, and mine was part of a whole layer of management that was being taken out. So that had come as a bit of a shock. So I had finished work by the end of January. And I had all sorts of ideas. I thought, oh, maybe now's the time for a sideways move, and maybe I'll try and move into, working, leaving the corporate world and going to work in the charity sector or something. And then the pandemic happened and lockdown. And it was kind of like, well, that's not a good idea to try because, obviously it was horrendous for everyone, very horrendous for the charity and not-for-profit sector. So fortunately, I had also literally kind of thrown in a bit of a last minute application to UCAS, which is essentially the British equivalent of the CAO system in
Yeah.
Ireland if you want to go to university. Because for years, decades, I'd always been really, really into history. In fact, when I went to UCD back in the 1980s, I very nearly studied archaeology, but I changed at the last minute to do science instead. I had realized archaeologists were very badly paid. So,
And spend their time
um,
in muddy fields.
so the whole thing about doing history had always been there. And I used to say sometimes, oh, if I played the lottery and if I won, I'd give up work in the morning and I'd go back to university and do a history degree.
Yeah.
So it kind of felt a bit like the stars suddenly came into this weird alignment. My job had been made redundant, but it did come with a very healthy payout. Thank you very much. Um, and the world literally kind of was coming to a stop. So I had already, just to give give myself some options. I had already thrown in an application to UCAS to a number of the London universities uh, to think about would I go back to university as a mature student to do a history degree. Um, and yeah, it turned out I was very encouraged. Most, not all, most of the universities I applied to in London came back and offered me a place. And actually, here I have to let me give a little personal shout out to Professor Mary Hickman, who's a
Oh,
huge stalwart
legend,
of
legend.
the Irish community and our presence and our history over here. Um, Mary was somebody I'd also met through campaigning, and I actually got in touch with her and asked her for some advice about, what might be the best university to go to as a very mature student, given that a mature student is technically over 21, and 21 was a long time ago for me. Um, and yeah, so the upshot of all of that was in September 2020, I started back to university, but like all the school leavers, doing it all remotely, through Zoom online. And I started a history BA at Queen Mary University of London in Mile End in East London. Did that for 3 years. Went into it thinking, oh, I'm women's history. That's what I'm going to be all about doing. And probably quite a bit of London history because I love the city so much. And then over the course of the degree, realized almost every assignment I did, I was desperately trying to find an Irish angle, and ideally an Irish and London angle. So by the time I finished my degree, which was I feel, profoundly fortunate, privileged, lucky to have had the opportunity to go back to university and study a topic I just really, really love. Um, so by the time that finished in 2023, I had decided I would go on and do a master's. And I ended up then spending 2023 to September 24. I did a master's in what's termed public history at University College London. And essentially, public history is about taking history out of academia. So
Like history of the people, really, isn't it?
history of the people is also very much part of academic study. But I suppose if you like, and I should say here, there's a great ongoing debate about what exactly is public history. But essentially, you can look at lots of heritage sites or even walking down the street and you might see a plaque on a building or people doing oral history or indeed some of the talks that I have given about Irish London history, but very much, in a local history setting. So it's very much about, I suppose, it's not just telling history and historical narratives, but researching it. It's there for all of us. And one of the things that was a great discovery for me and something I feel really, really passionate about is places like local history libraries and archives. They are there for us. Our council tax goes to supporting all of those organizations. And I can still remember how I, as a middle-aged, quite assertive woman, felt really anxious the first time I went into an archive. I thought, oh, what if I do something wrong? What if I'm not handling something? Maybe somebody will give out to me. And I've always kind of thought about that since then, about how those sort of institutions sometimes can feel almost kind of like a bit intimidating. Oh, it's not for us, it's for academics or it's for proper researchers. So that's been one of my kind of great, I don't know, almost a feeling of liberation since doing that study. It's like, no, any of us can go in and we can go to the archives and we can find out what they have. And in my experience, archivists and local history libraries are so welcoming and so helpful. Um, so I would almost do this as a shout out. If anyone has ever thought about it or not even thought about it, just check out what's available locally because there is nothing quite like that sensation of, say, like in my case, I'm sitting down in the archives in Tower Hamlets and I take a document out of a folder and it's handwritten, beautiful copperplate writing from 1822. And it is the formal warrant, which is essentially going to deport an Irish man who's been living in London for almost 30 years. He is being deported back to Ireland. And there's a note on it that's crossed out that's makes it clear that originally his daughter Esther Shea, was originally due to be sent back to Ireland with him, but presumably because she was actually born in London, at the last minute she doesn't go. So you've got to imagine that feeling. It's not just a document. It's like these are people's lives. So when you see that original document and you're holding it in your hand, it just comes alive for you. They're not just names and dates in the past. These are real people with real emotions and real family connections. And you can only kind of sit there and surmise, well, what was the conversation they had? What was that like? And of course, the times that we live in and a lot of the what can be, very distressing, personally, I find quite disturbing rhetoric
Yeah.
about migrants and migration. I do think it's very powerful to be reminded that we Irish were talked about in just the same way centuries before.
Yeah, yeah. Every time I get the opportunity, I always tell people that I think every Irish person should read The Lowly Londoners, that book,
Absolutely.
because it's told, it's all about the Windrush generation and what they went through, but what their stories are so similar to that of the Irish population. And what I really like about that book is how they describe the living conditions,
Yeah.
because yeah, they go and they meet their friends at the weekend and they have the parties and they have whatever, and it's just, from what I gather, it's so similar to what the Irish community was like. And then you go back to your, like, your single room, or your the room that you're renting from your landlady, and you don't see anybody for a week. You just get up, do your job, and keep your head down, totally depressed for the rest of the week. And I think it's something like that is just a stark reminder. I think because we're in the age we're in, we're really lucky
Yeah.
to have everything that's so close to us. Like, even 20 years ago, or 20 odd years ago, I moved over here I stayed here for about 10, 11 months.
Mhm.
Absolutely hated it. And the main difference between then and when I moved back here 11 years ago was the internet and the
Yeah.
access to being able to chat to people at home, or to access information and things like that. But with what you're talking about, the one thing that or the reason that I wanted to talk to you today was about a talk that's happening, that you're giving on the 15th of March. And it's all about 500 years of Irish women in Tower Hamlets. Incredible. That's incredible. Just how are you going to get all that into 2 hours?
Yes, yes, I believe it. I have had moments I kind of went, great, 45 minutes, 500 years, no problem. But let me roll back a little bit, actually, because this kind of connects with what I was just saying earlier. Um, so because I went back to university as a mature student, I went back to Queen Mary University, which is in Mile, and the Tower Hamlets Local History Library and Archives is literally just around the corner from the Queen Mary campus. And indeed, it was that archive was my first time kind of going in and being introduced to the world of archives and handling these documents and so on. Um, so when I was in there that time, I had some really interesting chats with the staff who were showing me around. And one of the things I was interested in chatting to the archives team about and then continue that conversation on subsequent visits, actually kind of throughout my master's studies as well, is that, and maybe just for the benefit of your listeners who may be not so familiar with London geography, so the borough of Tower Hamlets is basically, it's East London, north of the River Thames. So if you're looking at a map of London and you see the Tower of London, so just look to your right. The Tower of London is actually in the borough of Tower Hamlets. So you're talking about the areas of Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Bethnal Green, Wapping, Bow, Poplar, the Isle of Dogs. I'm sure I've forgotten one of them, and kind of the old parish of Stepney. Um, so it's a really old part of the city, and it has a really strong place in migrant history in London as well. Now, what is interesting is, and if you kind of keep an ear out for this, when you hear people talking about, be it Tower Hamlets specifically, or East London in general, there's almost a very well established narrative where people talk about, well, in the 1600s, the Huguenots arrived and they brought silk weaving, and that's why you have the association of silk weaving with Spitalfields. Brief sidebar, should say they turned up in Dublin as well, and which is why you have weaving connections between Dublin and Spitalfields. And then the narrative tends to kind of jump forward to the late 19th century when you had great waves of Jewish migration arriving, when you had the pogroms happening in Russia and Eastern Europe. And then the narrative jumps forward into the, the kind of the post 1950s, particularly into the 60s and 1970s in the 20th century. And then you have the waves of Bengali migration and migration from the Indian subcontinent more generally. And quite often that's the story. And going back to that first time I was in the archives chatting to the folks in the Tower Hamlets archives, and I was saying, but where are the Irish? Why are the Irish not talked about? Because in that long history, not just of Tower Hamlets, but in the long history of London, the Irish are the oldest quote unquote foreign population. And I use foreign kind of in the sense of historically how it's been used over the centuries. And in fact, up until the 1880s and that great wave of migration, of Jewish migration coming in from Eastern Europe, the Irish were the biggest foreign population. So there's a really interesting question there about how, I mean, one view could be, well, maybe that reflects the degree to which you have had assimilation and integration of the Irish population into London over the centuries. Um, I sometimes also, my own kind of pet theory is that when we talk about Irish London, I think our 20th century narrative is so strong because you say Irish London, I think for most people, myself included, what first comes to mind is Kilburn, Cricklewood,
God,
Camden,
you're all hearing
nannies
all
and
the stories.
nurses.
Yeah.
It's a huge, huge story, but it's almost like it's so dominant in our minds. I think it makes it easy to almost lose sight of literally the generations, the 500 years, 5 centuries at the very least, which predated that. Um, and so I think there's an interesting question there as to, well, what are the stories that we're not talking about? And I think they're particularly interesting because, probably you and I both went to school in Ireland and you grew up and you do history in Ireland. And of course, we learn an awful lot about England in Ireland over the sort of the infamous the 800 years.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the things that I realized in my kind of years living in London, and particularly as I started looking at the history of London, was I think we hear very little about the long history over how almost as many hundreds of years of Ireland and Irish people in London. So the stories are and the histories are deeply entangled over here in London as much as they are on the island of Ireland. And I think the other perhaps piece of nuance, perhaps the other nuance, I think that can get lost when we have these very dominant narratives of the Irish migrant experience from the 20th century. And then people, will probably go back to a bit thinking about the 19th century and after the famine. And it wasn't just people going to Liverpool, because we know there's a really strong Irish presence, say, in the docks, and why Irish dockers came out at the Battle of Cable Street in East London in 1936, and, to demonstrate against the fascists. So you can have that association with post-famine migration and what were termed the rookeries and the slums of London. But I think sometimes the unintended consequence of only focusing on those stories is that it almost becomes synonymous that to be Irish in London over the centuries was to be, at the very least, working class, if not poor and destitute, and Catholic. And while that certainly described the majority of the population, it wasn't a universal story. And actually, it's more nuanced and more complicated than that. And one of the questions I like to toy with is actually, if we think about the route that the St. Patrick's Day parade goes on in London, where you start down near
Down
Hyde
Green
Park
Park. Yeah,
Corner,
down
and
Green
you come up
Park
along
and
Green Park,
yeah.
and you come up to Trafalgar Square. So when you walk that route, you start very close to Apsley House, which is where the Duke of Wellington, born in Dublin, of the Anglo-Irish, ascendancy, and his Irish-born wife, Kitty Pakenham, daughter of the Earl of Longford. So you actually start very close to their house. And then as you go up along Green Park, you also pass very close to where Daniel O'Connell, so the great hero of Irish nationalism in the mid-19th century and the campaign for Catholic emancipation and repeal of the Act of Union, you pass by his house where he lived in the 1830s on Albemarle Street. And in between them, and there's no plaque or anything to mark it, there is also an address where a woman called Harriet Mellon Coutts, later the Duchess of Albemarle, lived. Her mother a was from Cork. She was from what was termed a cottier, a very, very poor peasant family. She ended up in the 1700s following a theatrical troupe to London. Her daughter Harriet is born in London. She becomes hugely successful on the London stage. She's a very, very smart woman. She ends up marrying Thomas Coutts of Coutts Bank, the Royal Bank. She ends up the wealthiest woman of the time. So when you're walking along that stretch, perhaps doing the St. Patrick's Day parade route, it's interesting to think about those three people are all coexisting in London with the poor, the workers, the destitute Irish of East London. And I think you can't tell one story without recognizing the other story as well. It makes a story more complicated, but I always think complicated stories are more interesting.
Are you writing a book with all these?
Well, not yet. What I've been gathering these stories. I've been gathering them for some time, and then basically I was able to use them for my master's because it was a public history master's. Instead of just writing a 12,000 word dissertation, for a public history master's, you have to create a piece of public history. So I built a website, a blogging website called www irishlondonhistory.com. Feel free to visit it. Um, and basically, what I used a lot of those stories to start building that. I mean, there's so many more stories still to tell, and I haven't had time to do too much work on it recently. But I think it's fascinating the juxtaposition of these stories because I think it gives us maybe a particularly, I mean, we know that London was a city of huge contrasts, of immense wealth and desperate, grinding poverty. But I think it's interesting to be almost to put like an Irish lens or filter on top of that and see how those contrasts were playing out at the same time. And imagine Daniel O'Connell, who was, well, in the 1830s living in Albemarle Street. I mean, there's various other places he lived as well. But then by the 1840s, he's turning up in East London in Whitechapel, and local there are local branches of the campaigning group for the repeal of the Act of Union there, and there's amazing descriptions in the newspapers of his welcome, and I think he's welcomed into something like the Order of St. Patrick. Apologies, the detail is escaping me now. Um, in the Catholic chapel out in Whitechapel, and I don't know. I think it's like there's stories and histories where those of us who grew up in Ireland and learned history in school in Ireland, and I always think that it's a bit like a three-dimensional object. By looking at the same stories from what was happening in London, you're looking at a different side, and the two sides coexist. But I think it's really interesting to think about how they coexisted and when they overlapped. And I suppose eventually getting back to my kind of opening point is that why is it we remember some stories and not others? And that's not a criticism of anyone or indeed myself, because I've been on this kind of, huge learning journey to find out about these things.
Well,
Uh,
they strike a chord with you. It's an emotional thing.
oh, very, very much so. Very much so. I do sometimes wonder, it's because, my dad's job, we moved around Ireland a lot when I was growing up. And I used to always say, oh, yeah, you try rocking up in a small village in Ireland that your family hasn't been in for 3 generations and you're a blow-in. It's like, well,
Mm.
how long do you stay a blow-in? So
Yeah, at least 30 years. At least 30 years.
exactly. But I know there was I actually I had to remind myself of this. There was actually a line I used on that website project I did for the masters when I was explaining why I was looking at this. And I wrote down then, I said, just as there is just as there is more than one way of being Irish today, there was more than one way of being Irish then.
Well, I have a thing on the radio show that I always say there's as many ways to be Irish as there are Irish people.
Exactly.
So, yay, I've been right. Yay! That's a big thumbs up for
Historically
me.
correct as well.
That's a big thumbs up for me. But I absolutely love how Tower Hamlets have been embracing this because you did a talk last year, I think it was last summer, and you're doing this one now, and it's brilliant that this is happening.
It is. Now, in actual fact, so you're right. I did do a talk last summer. That was actually in Hackney. So again, the borough that I live in. Again, for the benefit of people not familiar with London geography, Borough Hackney was just kind of north of Tower Hamlets. I actually live in Stoke Newington. Postcode is N16. That's why on social media you'll see me as N16 Breda. Um, so yeah, so again, I have to do a little bit of a shout out to some of the local historians because another kind of catalyst in all of this was as I was kind of finding these stories, and just sometimes literally just wandering around London, and I'd see something and I'd look it up and I would post it on Twitter when I was still there. Um, and it was actually a local historian in Stoke Newington called Amir Doughton. He got in touch and asked if I could do something on the Irish history of Stoke Newington. So that was another kind of 5 centuries and 25 minutes or something. Um, and then the Hackney Society and the Hackney Archives and various other people decided to have a Hackney History Festival last summer. So the talk I did then was on when Home Rule came to Hackney in the 1880s. And that turned out to be such a wild story. Oh, we could talk for hours just about that. Um, and then, yeah, so in the midst of all that, then Tara Hamlet's, the good folks of the archives got back in touch and were basically saying, well, we've been doing this work ourselves, trying to surface more of their own sources in the archives because they do great work at the Tower Hamlets Local History and Archives on, community engagement. They do, fantastic exhibitions. There will be one coming up shortly. Actually, it's just started called Communities of Liberation, which is also on that long history of migration to the area, but looking at people from Africa and people of African heritage in the area from like the Irish, from about the 16th century onwards. Um, so when Tower Hamlets got in touch, because of course, well, in March, it's Women's History Month, and of course, there's St. Patrick's Day, so it just seemed very obvious to try and do something on Irish women in Tower Hamlets. And again, in a long-winded way, getting back to your original question, Nessie, the reason I decided to do 500 years, now obviously it really is, I'm just cantering through. I've basically taken 5 centuries and one story, like a little vignette for each century. Because when people write histories or they're presenting historical narratives, you're always making a choice about what stories you tell and what stories you don't tell. And to be honest, I didn't want to just settle on one story or maybe a familiar story. I thought, as this is the first time that Tara Hamlets is doing a talk on this sort of Irish history, I thought, well, why don't we go for a big sweep?
Mhm.
And then that way I can start in the 16th century and Eleanor, Countess of Desmond, her husband, the Earl of Desmond, Gerald Fitzgerald, is imprisoned in the Tower of London. She comes over to lobby Elizabeth I unsuccessfully for his release and basically ends up kind of living in the tower with him for a couple of years. It's kind of a bit like day release. It's not the worst sort of imprisonment. So I thought that's a really interesting. So she's only temporarily in the area. But again, it's a reminder of because they are the Desmonds of the Desmond Rebellion that leads to the plantation of Munster at the end of the 1500s, a hugely, hugely important period in Irish history. And I think it's really interesting again that that has this connection with Tower Hamlets. I mean, there have been plenty of Irish prisoners in the Tower of London over the years. And then I can sort of just jump through, if I can just kind of tell you very briefly, there's this amazing story from 1765, and this is in the records of the Old Bailey, so the highest court in London at the time. And there's a woman called Mary Ryan, and she and her husband John Ryan and their son Jeremiah, they run a lodging house in an area called Rosemary Lane. So it's just east of the Tower. Basically, they end up at the Old Bailey. They're found guilty of stealing from one of the lodging house guests. And that man is called John Morgan. And he is a Muslim Indian trader who has come over to London because he's bringing over a cheetah from India at the request of the English governor of Madras. It's brought over, it's a gift, possibly for the king. It ends up in a menagerie in the Tower of London. Anyway, there ends up being this court report where basically, I'm sad to say, Mary Ryan and her husband John Ryan basically steal all of his money and his goods. They end up being transported for the crime. But there's a really fascinating detail in the Old Bailey court transcript. It describes their arrest and when I think it's the beadle or the local sheriff is they've found them in some bar and they're taking them to prison to be detained until the trial. And a comment is made is that Mary Ryan and John Ryan had to be separated because they kept talking to each other in Irish. That was one fascinating detail because again, I think it's very easiest to forget just how London was multilingual then as it is now, and how much the Irish language was live in London at the same time. The other reason I wanted to pick up on that story was, we might think, God, isn't that amazing? This Irish woman, Mary Ryan, meeting this Muslim man from India in London. Wild. Now, in actual fact, because London is already, the center of empire, there are lots of people from the continents of the Indian subcontinent, from Africa, people of color of all sorts of different heritage. But something which I think we in Ireland, certainly when I was growing up, and I did not learn about this in school, is how much Irish people were out in the empire. So it's this theme of entanglement again. And something I learned only very recently, and it's in fact for part of the research I'm doing I'll be doing another talk for the Hackney History Festival this year on Saturday, the 10th of May. And that is the fact that the East India Company, which was a British corporation, which essentially conquered India before, well, the company did very bad things and the British government stepped in. But at one stage, somewhere of the order of half of the private army of the East India Company were recruited from Ireland. And an awful lot of the officers in the East India Company's colonial infrastructure and military infrastructure were also from Ireland. And while lots of them may have been from, the Anglo-Irish kind of Protestant ascendancy class, a lot of them weren't as well. Um, and again, it's a conversation for another day. They're in some of the most shameful events that happened under the East India Company. Yes, Irish men were deeply, deeply involved in those. So again, given our history, I think it's another aspect of it's a different way of looking at that history. Yes, Ireland was colonized, but yes, Irish people were also colonizers themselves as part of that imperial project. And all of which makes me think that so when Mary Ryan in 1765 was stealing money and goods from her lodging house guest, well, that may not have been the first time that she had met a man from India, or indeed that the man from India had met an Irish woman, although you would hope they wouldn't have been in the habit of stealing from each other.
Breda, it has been absolutely wonderful chatting to you. If people want to get tickets, I know this has been held in the library.
It is. So it's Tower Hamlets Local History Library. Let me say that again. Tower Hamlets Local History Library on Archives on Bancroft Road in Mile End. If you just Google it, you'll find it. They have a page, they have an Eventbrite page where you can get tickets. Tickets are free, but I do understand they're going quite quickly. And the event starts at 2 o'clock.
It sounds like it will be absolutely fascinating, and it's just I think it's crazy. The more you dig in, the more it's like an onion. You just keep getting these layers upon layers upon layers. Tell us again your website and where people can find you.
Absolutely. So the website is called just www.irishlondonhistory.com. You can contact me there, or I have an email address, irishlondonhistory@gmail.com. On social media these days, you can look for Breda Corish, N16 Breda. I'm not active on Twitter anymore. It's just too horrendous over there. So I'm mainly on Blue Sky these days. I love to hear from people, not just with questions, but also I learn so much from the stories that people bring to me as well. So if I can do on behalf of the Hackney History Festival, a little shout out. Saturday, the 10th of May, it'll be 10 o'clock in the morning, a little bit early. I will be talking about an analysis I've done of the 1851 census, and I'm looking at who were the Irish-born people in Hackney and Stoke Newington. And let's just say there are some surprises in there, hence my reference earlier to the East India Company in particular. Again, if you just Google the Hackney History Festival 2025, you find the details. Tickets are available. They're only about £3. It's a program that runs for several days. There's an amazing, amazing set of talks. You can buy a weekend pass and everything. And at some stage later in the year, we haven't sorted out a date yet, but the good people of the St. Giles Society, which is associated with the Church of St. Giles in the Fields, just behind Tottenham Court Road, which is also the site of what was one of the infamous Irish rookeries of the 19th century. We are just trying to sort out a date where I'll go and do a short talk with them on the Irish history of that area as well. But yeah, I would love to hear from people, questions, suggestions, feedback, what people think about the whole approach to this nuanced, entangled story. I love to hear from people because Nessie, as you can tell, I love talking about this topic.
Rita, thank you so, so much for joining me today and for sharing all your wealth of knowledge as well. Really do appreciate it. And if you want to go to the Tower Hamlets archives, you can actually find them on Instagram as well, just Tower Hamlets archives. There's links there where you'll be able to get tickets. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you very much, Nessie. It's been an absolute pleasure.